Namaskara. Welcome to Music Beyond Borders, celebrating the life and work of Vanraj Bhatia. This BIC Streams session is in collaboration with the International Music and Arts Society, which seeks to bring Vanraj Bhatia to the attention of a wider audience with the help of musicians Zubin Balaporia and Shwetant Kumar, who were closely acquainted with the composer and his work and will discuss his music in depth today. You could say Vanraj Bhatia's music crosses boundaries the way people cross the street. He was trained in Indian classical music from his school days and in Western classical music in London and in Paris, where he was Nadia Boulanger's only Indian student. Frequently working with the best musicians and the latest technology in India, Bhatia created music that was as impossible to pigeonhole as was his colorful personality. His 60-year career spanned multiple disciplines: cinema, television, documentaries, major theater productions, spiritual music, advertising jingles, 7,000 of them, Western classical, and also New Age music. It is very likely that every person in India knows at least one piece of music by him, even if they've never heard of him. We take this opportunity to celebrate Vanraj, his life and his music in our own small way. Now, do permit me to speak on behalf of IMAS. The International Music and Arts Society has been promoting the arts for the last 45 years and is proud to be associated with Bangalore International Centre to present Music Beyond Borders, an interaction on the prolific composer Vanraj Bhatia, a legend in the music world of India, who passed away in early May. However, before that, we would like to observe a moment's silence to honor both his memory and also that of the president of our society, Mrs. Ila Chandrasekhar. Mrs. Ila Chandrasekhar, president of the International Music and Arts Society, passed away on the 21st of May, 2021. Her passing is a great loss to our society, which she steered for the last 15 years after the death of our founder president, Rani Vijaya Devi. Ila, as she was popularly known, was a gracious and committed leader, a connoisseur of the arts, and a talented artist herself who took a deep interest in the society's activities. In the earlier years, she and her husband, the late Dr. S. Chandrasekhar, were responsible for arranging many of our stellar events, like the exhibitions by M.F. Hussain and K.K. Hebbar, and a recital by the great cello maestro, Mstislav Rostropovich. On her suggestion, we have been compiling a book on the Society's contribution to the arts over 45 years, which we hope to launch this year. Do join us in a moment's silence. I would now like to invite Zubin and Shwetant to take over.
Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you for inviting us to speak today. My name is Zubin Balaporia, and along with my musical compatriot Shwetant Kumar, we're going to explore today the incredible music and the amazing life of maestro composer Vanraj Bhatia. Today would have been his 94th birthday. To us, he was a close friend, a mentor of sorts, and a living encyclopedia on Western classical music and composition. He would call me every day at 9 a.m. and then sometimes again at 9 p.m. too, for the last 20 odd years. And I really do miss those calls where we would laugh, banter, discuss music, and sometimes argue about it. Not sometimes, quite often, in fact, argue about it, which was good. So firstly, just a little bit about Vanraj's history and background. Then we'll go on to play a lot of his music for you. He was born in Bombay to a well-to-do Kutchi business family in 1927. His family was fond of Indian music, and as a young child, Vanraj often told me that he was brought up on the music of Marathi and Gujarati plays and dramas. Personally, I really think his Indian musical training came greatly from this listening to this music in these plays rather than formal Indian classical training. But it seems he did learn some Hindustani classical music as a student, but he told me many a time that upon hearing Tchaikovsky's Piano Concerto Number 1 as a young teenager, he just went absolutely crazy and became besotted with Western classical music and began to learn and study piano with Dr. Manik Bhagat for about 4 years. He told me actually that the music of Tchaikovsky traumatized him. You know, it wouldn't leave him. He would just hear it all the time in his head. And of course, Bach, Beethoven, all the big composers he was very fond of, but I think he had a special fondness for Tchaikovsky's music. Anyways, after finishing his studies at Elphinstone College in Bombay, he went off to study composition, music composition at the Royal Academy of Music in London, where he was the recipient of the Sir Michael Costa Scholarship. After graduating with a gold medal in 1954, he won a Rockefeller Scholarship and as well as a French government scholarship that allowed him to study with the great teacher Nadia Boulanger at the Conservatoire de Paris for 5 years. He once told me that the grant was for, I forget, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, but he wanted the money to stretch because he just didn't want to come back. So he stopped eating food and he virtually starved himself and he almost contracted tuberculosis in trying to just extend that money so that he could stay on, watch, learn, and listen to music in Paris. Anyways, I suppose at some point of time the money ran out and then he returned to Bombay. Now, during the course of speaking, I'm going to say Bombay and not Mumbai because Vanraj would get very angry with me if I ever said Mumbai. And in conversation, if I said something, you know, in Mumbai, he would say, it's not Mumbai, damn it, it's Bombay, say Bombay, say Bombay. So I'm more than happy to say Bombay or Mumbai, whatever. But today we will say Bombay. So when he returned to Bombay, what followed was a really prolific career in theatre and film music, as well as original works for piano, strings, voice, and various other instruments. Some 6,000 television and radio music jingles, about 60 film and countless documentary music scores, music awards, a full-fledged opera that will hopefully be staged someday, and a Padma Shri. Vanraj Bhatia passed away peacefully in his home on the 7th of May, 2021. I met Vanraj for the first time in 1985 when he called me for a recording at Bombay Live Studios. As a young musician just starting his career in the studios of Bombay, I was very nervous because we had heard a lot of stories of how difficult he was to work with, temperamental, and he could shout and yell at you in the studio, you know, if you made a mistake. But I'm happy to say that my first recording with him went off pretty smoothly. He, on that recording, insisted I play acoustic piano, which I was very happy to do, but the piano for some reason in that studio was slightly out of tune. So I had carried my synthesizer at that time and I told him that, you know, now with technology, modern keyboards, we can also play some kind of piano sounds as well, tones as we used to call it then. And he very grudgingly allowed me to use an electronic instrument in his recording because he was definitely not fond of that in those years at least. After that, we recorded many, many projects together. In general, he was greatly appreciative of my ability to improvise on the piano and disgusted by my inability to sight read music, of course, at his level. And on one occasion, when I proudly played a Bach piece for him, and I love playing Bach, he told me, "You have absolutely no feel for Bach." So that's the kind of guy he was, direct and straight to the point, no punches pulled. He lived his life on his own terms. His passion for classical music was only matched by his passion to live his life to the fullest, which he most certainly did. Okay, time to hear some music now. But before I do that, I'd like to introduce Shwetant to all of you. Shwetant is a super musician and an incredibly gifted young man who has scoured the internet for all of Vanraj's forgotten music. He has also archived all of Vanraj's scores, and let me tell you, that is quite a task. Vanraj was so happy with what Shwetant did that he's appointed him as his principal archivist, and we will continue to keep this music alive as long as we can. Over to you, Shwetant.
Thank you, Zubin. Hello, everyone. Um, Now, everyone has their own story of how they met Vanraj, and it's usually a very good one. Mine is no different. I wrote him a letter because I found his address on the internet, and he was stunned that someone 70 years younger than him knew so much about his music. So he invited me home, and eventually he said, "You know, you're a musician. My house is a mess. I have scores all over the place. Do something." So I started going to his house every Sunday morning and cataloging everything, archiving everything. And then I started doing more things of my own volition. I started digitizing all his cassettes, all his tape reels, with a little help from someone we shall meet shortly. And eventually he made me his official archivist, and he gave me my first and only paycheck. And I knew he was in very dire financial straits. To date, I have never taken any money for any work I've done for him. So the next time I met him, he said very incredulously, "You know, there's still money in my account. Didn't you cash that check in?" So I told him, "No, I'm going to frame that check instead." So for the next half hour, he called me every name he could possibly think of and then threw me out of his house. That was the first of many, many arguments we had, all of which I lost, by the way. But I think the fact that I lost them made him trust me. And in fact, he trusted me enough that when I asked him if I could write a book on his life and his music and interview everyone he worked with, he agreed. And that is an ongoing process as well. So back to the archive, there were around 3,000 sheets of handwritten music at Vanraj's house and 60 hours worth of recordings. And I'm very happy to say that you shall see and hear some of them over the course of this webinar. Back to you, Zubin.
Thanks, Shwetant. So Vanraj spent the last 15 years of his life at home writing an opera titled Agni Varsha. It is based on a play by the late great Girish Karnad, and the libretto of the opera is written by Rani Devpura and Ranjit Hoskote. And I'm very happy that Rani is on the session today and instrumental in setting up this talk. Congratulations, Rani. Well done. So the first part of this opera, Agni Varsha, was premiered in New York City in 2012 in a production by the internationally known soprano, Professor Judith Kellogg from Cornell University. We are going to play you a short excerpt from this performance, but please note, of course, that this is a condensed version only for piano and voices. So try, if you will, to close your eyes as the music plays and visualize it in its full glory with the correct ambience, costumes, and lighting on a large stage with all the trimmings that a full-blown opera would require.
Give
Great, thank you. So just to explain this a bit, when you're writing for an opera, and Vanraj wrote all his scores by hand. He hated the computer. He had no interest in knowing how it worked. He was not fond of technology at all. So all his scores were written by hand, and you will see some of them as we go along. But when you're writing for opera, you have this huge big sheet of paper, and you are writing for voices, you're writing for the strings, violin, viola, second violin, first violin, second violin, viola, cello, brass, trombone, French horn, woodwinds, flutes, percussion instruments. So it's horribly, horribly complicated. And you don't obviously have the liberty of the orchestra sitting in your house. So it's all here in the mind as you're writing it. And he would call me sometimes and say, do you know, it's taken me 3 hours to write 1 bar of music. So that 1 bar of music would be for about 3 or 4 seconds or 5 seconds or something like that. And that had taken him 3 hours to do. So quite a monumental task, and I do hope this opera will be staged in its full form and glory someday. Okay, now we jump to the other end of Vanraj's musical spectrum, from serious opera to writing commercial television music. So it would be more than justified to call Vanraj India's most prolific jingle composer. For those of you who may not understand the term jingle, it's a term loosely used to define a piece of music usually sung that accompanies a television commercial or an ad, as we sometimes call it. Amongst his many, 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 many jingles, one that caught everyone's fancy was the famous Lidl commercial. Though this was not an original work, but an adaptation, it still breathes an air of vitality and freshness even 35 odd years after it aired on Indian television. Take a listen.
With little freshness, tingling, tangier, with the exciting freshness of lives. Live the freshness soap to make a fresh new woman of you.
You've seen this ad on television many years ago. It means, like me, you are either middle-aged or prehistoric. The singer on this, I believe, is the wonderfully talented Sharon Pravakar. And though this was composed and released before I joined the music industry, in later years, we must have played multiple, at least 20 variants of this composition, definitely in my career as a studio musician. Okay, moving on, we now move to Vanraj's film music. Vanraj's association with the legendary new wave cinema director Shyam Benegal is of course well known. I think he composed music for 17 of Shyam's films, including films like Ankur, Nishant, Bhumika, and Manthan. One particular song has an interesting backstory, and it is a song from the film Manthan. So it seems that when Vanraj was recording this song, it was very close to his heart because the scene was set in Kutch, very much from where his family originally came from. And he was basically, as Shwetant very correctly puts it, musically tone painting the scene. However, for some reason, Vanraj was not happy with the lyrics in the studio. And while he was teaching the song to a young new singer called Preeti Sagar, of course, Preeti would go on to become one of Bombay's leading playback singers later. And as Vanraj and Shyam went back and forth on the lyrics, Preeti's sister, Neeti, who had come to watch her elder sister sing in the studio, scribbled something on a notepad and very shyly approached Vanraj and said, "Uncle, will this work?" And when Shyam and Vanraj read the lyrics, they were just struck by their simplicity and honesty. And those became the lyrics that Preeti eventually sang for the song Mero Gaam Katha Pare. So here's a small excerpt.
दूध की नदियाँ वाहे जा कोयल को गाए मारे घर अंगना
So just in 3 clips of music, we can see the diverse talent of the man, from serious opera, jingle writing for commercial television, folk vibe and infused music for this movie. Incidentally, this was the first film to be entirely crowd-funded by 5 lakh Gujarat farmers, each contributing 2 rupees. The movie, based on the idea brought by Mr. Varghese Kurian, was made to stimulate the people to stop getting influenced by Bicholia, the middleman, and gave an impetus to form a government-owned dairy which would bypass all middlemen. That dairy, as some of you might know, is Amul, and it was formed as a cooperative which galvanized into a huge and wonderful corporation that they are today. Amul, of course, later on adopted this song and it became their sort of anthem of sorts. And veteran filmmaker Sham, who made Manthan, Sham Benegal, describes his association beautifully with Vanraj when he says, Vanraj's music complemented my films perfectly, like the second arc of a circle. His knowledge and understanding of music was immense. I do not know anyone else whose musical knowledge was so profound. I think that couldn't have been put better. So we move on now to Vanraj, the man and his possessions. Because to get to know Vanraj's music a little better, you also have to understand the man and his passion for life. He was an extremely positive person and he hated any kind of pretensions. His mannerisms and speech were very polished, and he spoke Gujarati exactly like a Parsi would. A lot of his close friends were Parsis, and he always said that that was where he first heard Western classical music, ate non-vegetarian food, and learned how to drink whiskey. His apartment in Bombay was furnished traditionally and typically with very fine and very opulent tastes. Every piece of furniture personally selected by him. He once told me that even the beautiful etching and designs on his ceilings were created under his baton, and he used to lie on the floor pretty much like Michelangelo and then direct the karigars on how he wanted the ceilings done. He also had a beautiful collection of antique lamps, and he very generously left me one in his will, which, as you can see, burns brightly right behind me over there. He lived a bohemian lifestyle with parties and gatherings every week. He dressed impeccably in suits and shoes from London and Paris, loved his scotch, loved his vodkas. And he was a fabulous chef, and he could whip up the most delicious quiche. So I must digress a little, but I have to tell you the story because it truly illustrates the kind of guy he was. So about 20 or 25 years ago, he invited me and my wife over for dinner. And he said, I'm going to make my famous quiche for you all. And I said, wonderful, I've heard so much about it, so I'm looking forward to it. Then 2 days before we were supposed to go over, he calls me and says, look, there's a bit of a problem. So I said, what? So he said, my quiche has bacon in it, and your wife is a Bori, she's a Muslim, she doesn't eat pork. So what am I going to do? So I said, well, she won't eat it, or if you don't mind, could you just make a smaller portion without bacon? And he got very angry. You can't make quiche without bacon. What's wrong with you? So I said, okay, if you can't make it without bacon, then she won't have it. And he said, no, that doesn't work. I want her to eat it. So do one thing, just don't tell her. Just don't tell her there's any pork in it and let her eat it. So of course, I said, no, Vanraj, I can't do that. But that's the kind of guy he was, very meticulous and very proper. It had to be done like that or it wasn't to be done at all. So back to music now. We move on to another wonderful association, that between Vanraj and Shashi and Jennifer Kapoor, and by extension, the entire Kapoor family, Kunal, Karan, and Sanjana. Vanraj did music for so many of their home productions, some of which are Junoon, and of course my favorites, 36 Chaurangi Lane and Kalyug. After Shashi and Jennifer passed away, Kunal has always stayed in touch and has helped Vanraj in more ways than one. I know Vanraj was extremely fond of Kunal, and I'm happy to say that we have a very special celebrity guest, none other than Mr. Kunal Kapoor himself with us today. And who better than him to tell us about the Kapoor and Vanraj Bhatia story. Welcome, Kunal.
Hi. Hi. So, thanks, Zubin. Quite a interesting introduction. So I don't know about the Kapoor connection with Vanraj, but my connection with Vanraj was really through Junoon, through Sham Benegal and Dad. So he had done the music for Junoon, obviously. And in the process, he became very fond of my mother. And my parents became very fond of him. And he lived just down the road from us. So he came over quite often. And my mother would go very often to his house for dinner, for these famous dinners where, I mean, most of them were, like you said, were Parsi, old, retired women, mostly women, very few men. I actually don't remember. I don't think I've ever been invited to his house for dinner. I've been to his house many times. I've had a drink with him in his house, but I don't think I've ever been invited for dinner because I wasn't A, a woman, and B, I think I was probably a bit too Indian, not enough English in me. Sorry, I thought I put it on silent. So anyway, I met him through Junoon. I met him socially, and then, of course, 36 Charangi Lane. And he did the music, and then I started doing commercials. And the first commercial I did, that I produced and directed, was a commercial for Dulux Paint, which he did the music for. And I think that tune is still being used today. And that would have been, I think, in the late 80s. And it was, then we went on to doing a lot of commercials together. It worked very well for me. I liked his music. I liked his orchestration. And like you said, his knowledge of music and his knowledge and ability to marry the music with the visuals, to push the visual forward. That was very important to me. I found most people who did music in film, particularly commercials, they wrote jingles, they wrote ditties, they wrote songs. They didn't push the visual, they didn't push the film, which Vanraj understood, and he always did. So if you look at any of his work, you'll find it. The visual content that you're seeing, the emotions and the feeling of that is completely reflected and enhanced by his music. That is the quality of a true music composer for feature films or for the visual medium. So yeah, I mean, Vanraj was a cankerous old man, bloody difficult to work with. And I don't think there's a single person who's worked with him who hasn't fought with him and argued with him. But the wonderful thing about him was that he didn't carry it. So he would argue with you, he would say this is rubbish, but if you could convince him that it worked, he'd accept it. And that, I think, again, was an amazing quality about him. But he loved his drink, and he loved his food, and I liked it too. So we had a common thing there. Besides, film and music, it was food and drink. But hail Vanraj.
Thanks, Kunal. I think you put that perfectly, particularly the fact of how he brought the visual out in his music. That's something that's really struck me as well. His ability to write non-film music, which was beautiful, and at the same time write film to picture, where the picture would really, really come alive with whether it be background score or song, either way.
Absolutely. I mean, even if he did music for a film, like he did the background music for Ajuba, which was the last film that my father produced, the one that he directed. Now, Lakshmikant Pyarelal had done the songs. But for some reason, I mean, I'm not sure why, I don't know, I wasn't around at that particular time, but Dad decided and gave him the background score to make, which he did. So, I mean, it was a very commercial film. It was not an art house film at all. And it worked, and it worked well. And, he was never ashamed of it or boasted about it. He just took it professionally, all right? Just the way he would do a Shyam Benegal film or an art film or a jingle. He didn't really differentiate.
Super. So we're going to move on now to a song from Junoon. And Kunal, thanks for the footage. Very grateful to you for that. And in 1978, the great Mohammad Rafi sang for Vanraj for the first time in the song Ishq Na Todi. it seems that Rafi Saab had been told he would be singing a ghazal. But when he walked into the studio, he saw 4 trombones and a full orchestra. Not the kind of orchestration you would normally have in a ghazal. And he got extremely scared. And I believe he beat a hasty retreat. And Vanraj had to virtually chase him down and catch him in his car and tell him, look, it'll be fine. Just come in and let me show you the song. And eventually, Rafi Saab agreed to come back, heard the melody, and he sang it absolutely beautifully. So here's an excerpt from the song.
इश्क ने तोड़ी सर पे कयामत, जोरे कयामत क्या कहिए, सुनने वाला कोई नहीं, रुदा दे मोहब्बत क्या रुदा दे मोहब्बत क्या कहिए।
So I should just explain, that's actually Vanraj's handwritten score, which we used to just illustrate. I know, obviously, most of you all will not be able to read that. Frankly, even I can't read most of it because it's very, very complicated. But he wrote all his scores by hand, and they all looked like this, very beautifully written, all the parts for all the musicians, etc. So that was Ishq Tori from June 1978. And now we move on to another song, another theme, one that has always touched me. I've performed it at Zakir Hussain, with Zakir Hussain at the NCPA for a Vanraj tribute concert, and also under Zakir Bhai's baton at Prithvi Theatre. Kunal, you will remember that concert fondly. And it has a beautifully constructed, complex melody. And at a rehearsal, my assistant shot a video of us rehearsing this. So I'd like to show you this video because I believe there's some magic in the performance and the music, despite it being just a low-grade video of the rehearsal. This is Violet's theme from 36 Charangi Lane. I'm going to let that sink in for a while. It's such beautiful music, and even though it's just shot on a small phone with horrible video quality, there's some magic in that piece. And it's beautifully written, it's complex and yet simple in a strange way. And then after he wrote this, he wrote something which was so simple and so basic. I have to play it to you from my keyboard right here. So that was what I call the kind of B theme for 36 Chaurangi Lane. And there's yet another beautiful theme called the alternate lovers theme, which Shwetant is going to play for us on guitar. Go for it, Shwetant.
Right. The story goes that what Zubin just played was going to be the original Lovers theme, but the filmmaker Aparna Sen thought otherwise. So Vanraj had to come up with another. So this is what he did. He took the same rhythm as what you just heard, but changed all the notes so that it is now in Rag Miyaki Malhar. And then, Vanraj being Vanraj, he decided that in some scenes where you see the lovers and the main character together, he will play both these themes simultaneously, which could have been a disaster. But because he had all this training, he wrote them around in such a way that they worked together. So you heard that, I hope. And I just realized my guitar may have been off the first time I played it. Sorry about that. So the alternate lovers theme is. You heard that. And then under that in the strings, you heard the original 36 theme. Only Vanraj could have thought of something like that, in my opinion.
Thanks, Shwetant. I think it would be great if you take over and tell us about the next couple of pieces.
All right. Now, The one word that everyone associates with Vanraj is orchestration, taking a lot of instruments together and assigning them parts so that they do not get in one another's way. And he was one of the very few people, as Zubin said, who could write out all the parts on his own and not rely on arrangers, for instance. One of the few times he got any kind of official recognition was for the film Tamas. He won his only National Film Award for that film, largely because the composer Salil Chowdhury was on the jury. Now, this film was the only time, with the exception of the films we have already seen, that Vanraj got to work with an actual large orchestra of Western proportions and dimensions. Otherwise, he never had the budget for that. And you can hear why. Because in the clip we are going to see, you can imagine the kind of film that, for instance, you'd associate with David Lean, for example. It's this vast, epic, cinematic, huge scope. So you will see the score as well. You will see what he wrote and where. And if you are not a musician, do not panic. Reading music is like reading any other language. You read it from left to right. The most important line is usually at the top. And if you hear vocals, the lyrics will be written under them. So have fun. Right. That is one of those pieces of music where I think after that they can only be followed by silence. But we do not have enough time for that, so we'll have to move on. Now, the first thing Vanraj did after returning from his training in Europe was to take the position of musicologist at the University of Delhi. And he hated it because he hated musicology. If you mention the word to him, at least in my presence, he would ask for his vodka bottle. He hated it that much. And yet, I think this was because he did everything very intuitively. He did not believe in studying anything for the sheer sake of study. And in fact, he had to do this for two songs rather, from the same film, Bhumika, each of which was set in a different decade. The first song, which remains one of his most famous, is Tumhare Bin Jeena Lage. Now, this song was set in the 1930s, the decade Vanraj grew up in. He was a huge fan of R.C. Boral and K.L. Saigal. And the one sound that you hear throughout that decade in Hindi film music is the Jal Tarang. So Vanraj went and got a Jal Tarang player who had had no work for decades. And the song itself is in Rag Tilak Kamod, except one line, Badal gayi main to ek nazar mein. The moment you hear the word Badal, Vanraj changes the raga to Pilu. And the moment that line is over, he moves back to Tilak Kamod again, which is perhaps a very intuitive thing to do. I don't think he thought about it. Also, fun fact, this song only ever got one take because the recordist and the musicians were so annoyed with Vanraj for bringing what they called old-fashioned junk into the studio. They refused to play it twice. So the only version of the song you hear everywhere is the very first take you heard. And we shall hear it right now.
तुम्हारे बिन जीना लगे घर में, तुम्हारे बिन जीना लगे घर में, बलम जी तुमसे मिला के अखियाँ, बलम जी तुमसे मिला के अखियाँ, तुम्हारे बिन जीना लगे घर में। बदल गई मैं तो एक नजर में, बदल गई मैं तो एक नजर में, बलम जी तुमसे मिला के अखियाँ, तुम्हारे बिन जीना लगे घर में।
Right, now that sounds very much like the 1930s, except for the kind of singing, which had fallen out of fashion by that point. For the other song, however, Sawan Ke Din Aaye, for that, Vanraj had to move to the early 1950s, and he did a very interesting thing. He went and got hold of the musician who played an instrument called the piccolo trumpet on all the Raj Kapoor films. He tracked that man down and got him to play on this song. And as with the Jaltarang player, that particular person had had no work for many, many years. So between that and the use of clarinets, again, instruments that had fallen out of fashion by the 1960s, I think, the sound could have belonged in an RK production. It's not very different from something like Pyar Hua, Ikrar Hua from Shri 420. It belongs very much in that decade. And you shall soon hear why.
सावन के दिन आए सजनवा, मिलो बरखा जिया तरसाए सजनवा, मिलो
पूरी सही न जाए सजनिया, याद तुम्हारी आए सजनिया, आन लो बिरहा जिया
तरसाए सजनवा,
सजनिया मिलो।
Right. So you heard the trumpet very clearly, the part that went ta-ra-ra-ra-ra, ta-ra-ra. It also opens the song. It sounds very, very nostalgic, I suppose, if you were around in that decade. I was not. So between all this and the music we have heard so far, you might think that Vanraj was clearly off mainstream completely, that he did not belong in his period at all. And yet he was using musicians that were around at the same time. So was Vanraj mainstream or not? You would think a man who did 7,000 jingles was. So to answer that question, we now have to play some music that was not by Vanraj and which in fact is by R.T. Burman. It is a song called Dil Ki Baat from the film Teri Kasam. And I would like you all to look carefully at the musicians and see if you recognize anyone.
दिल की बात कहीं लब पे ना आ जाए, हंसते हंसते आंख कहीं ना भर आए, ओ दिल की बात कहीं लब पे ना आ जाए, हंसते हंसते आंख कहीं ना भर आए, याद रहे क्या दिल की बात कहीं लब पे ना आ जाए,
Now, Zubin, you had just entered the industry at this point. Do you recognize anyone?
Oh yeah, actually, this is a little before my time, but definitely Casey Lord and the great Louis Banks, both of them excellent keyboard players, pianists. I'm not sure if that's Sunil playing guitar, is it?
That is him, yes.
Sunil Kaushik on guitar. Um, I would presume the other musicians would be Franco Vaz on drums, Tony Vaz on bass, and because these were the guys that topped the senior most musicians around and great players, all of them, and they were used by all the senior composers of Bollywood in those days.
Absolutely. And there were, in fact, two composers who used these five musicians as a group very often. And those two were R.D. Burman and Vanraj Bhatia. So we shall now listen to another piece of music that was done at the same time, featuring the same musicians, but for a documentary that Vanraj had scored.
Very unusual music from Vanraj, I have to say. In some shades of James Bond and early, I don't know, sort of early electronic Kraftwerk meets techno, whatever you want to call it. So actually, this is something that's quite amazing because I know that he hated the drum kit, he hated drums, and he personally being a rock musician in a rock band myself, and he used to always ask me, why do you like all that bang bang music, all that? And the drums, they just go dang, dang, dang all the time. What do you like about it? I hate the drum kit. If there was no rhythm, it would be fantastic. So it's a very unusual piece of music for him to have composed, but that's another dimension, another side of him. But one thing I'd like to emphasize that, you know, he worked with some really great musicians, and he was, although he wrote his parts down and he expected the musicians to deliver, he gave them a free hand. I mean, on many occasions, even he would sketch out a scene and then he would leave us to kind of, orchestrate, instrument it a little bit, come back, fine tune it, and it would all be fantastic. So I have to say, and I think those musicians really contributed a lot to his sound. And in that, a couple of people I'd definitely like to mention. One was the great composer arranger, Casey Lord, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago. Casey was Vanraj's right-hand man for many years. Our wonderful jazz pianist Louis Banks played so much piano for Vanraj, including the 36 Charangi Lane piano that you heard was played by Louis. Viju Shah, another wonderful composer, keyboard player, who was so taken in by Vanraj's orchestration that he used to go to his house every Sunday morning to learn from him. Ashok Patkiji, fantastic keyboard player. Sunil Kaushik, super guitar player on thousands and thousands of Vanraj's sessions. Raju Singh, Franco Vaz, industry stalwart drummer. Taufik Qureshi, percussionist. Bassist Dominic, I forget his second name. And I'd also like to mention Badhur Nanji. Badhur Nanji was an arranger, and he used to help Vanraj with a lot of his parts in orchestrating them and making the copies for all the string players and whatever. A very valuable sort of person who contributed a great deal to getting the whole score sounding the way it did. Okay, Shwetant, back to you.
All right, now the list of musicians who worked with Vanraj is very long. Among them are also some classical musicians who put in guest appearances from time to time, such as Pandit Shiv Kumar Sharma or Pandit Rono Majumdar. And one more person who we shall hear twice over the course of this webinar. Now, this might sound strange given that Vanraj is famous for Manthan and Bhumika and Mandi and Sardari Begum and so on. But he always had a reputation for being too Western for India, whatever that means. And it was something he had to overcome time and again. So I would next like to play you the clip and show you the score from a song called Barse Ghan Sari Raat from Kumar Shahani's film Tarang. Now, this is one of the most difficult and complex songs to come out of India. It is as good as anything from Mahler's orchestral song cycles, for instance. Now, Kumar Shani had come to Vanraj with a very limiting brief in Vanraj's words. He wanted a song that would take a poem in blank verse by the Hindi poet Raghuveer Sahai, set it to a combination of three Hindustani ragas, Mand, Jogya, and Bhimpalas, and also put it in a tal, ek tal, actually Vilambit ek tal, which is very, very slow, which is why the entire song is around 7 minutes long. Now, Vanraj, being Vanraj, hit the roof at all these limitations, but he ended up doing what even he considered one of his greatest songs. He thought so highly of it that, according to him, only Lata Mangeshkar could have sung it, which he did for free. And you will also hear the great Ustad Sultan Khan on Sarangi. This is all Vanraj ever did. And in the score, you will see the words written for the lyrics, so you can follow along, as well as the tal written out, because Vanraj was not a great stickler for rules in general, whether it was in his life or in his music. This song is an exception.
Really incredibly written and incredibly sung also. Very beautiful. So we move on now to some of Vanraj's more Western classical writing. And this is a fugue from Fantasia and Fugue in C, which he wrote in 1999. It was performed and premiered by pianist Pallavi Mahidhara, who at that time was based out of New York. I believe she is a professor of music now in Spain. The fugue subject is inspired by that of Brahms's Handel Variations, one of Vanraj's favorite piano pieces. And I had the pleasure of watching Pallavi actually playing it in Bombay at somebody's house. Post that, I think she enjoyed it so much that she made it part of her repertoire for many years to perform all over internationally.
Okay. So that fugue, believe it or not, was written in Rag Purya Dhanashri. And to the best of my knowledge, it is the only fugue ever written in a raga. But then that was Vanraj for you. He was always trying to do things that were supposedly impossible. So one thing Vanraj liked to do, and we are reaching the end now with some of his finest work, was repurpose material. If he felt whatever he had written was not going to survive for very long, say he wrote it for a jingle or a TV show, he would rewrite it for what he thought was a more lasting medium, such as a work of Western classical music. So our next example was actually originally written for the TV show Bharat Ek Khoj. Vanraj took 6 songs from that TV show, each of which was set in a raga, and rewrote them for a chorus, a choir. And he wrote these works in such a way that if you look at each single line, they are really 4 lines put together. Every line follows the grammar of the raga exactly. But if you put all 4 of them together, they also follow the rules of Western composition and contrapuntal writing and so on. It is quite a feat. This work was written, it was called 6 Seasons. It was written for and premiered by the Paranjyoti Academy Chorus in Bombay. And the conductor of the chorus, Kumi Bhatia, and her son who sang in the chorus, Saurabh Bhatia, still think very highly of this work even today. So you are going to hear one of the 6 seasons. It is called Varsha, and it is in Rag Megh Malhar.
That was great. I just noticed something at the end of the score. It says end can be PP or FF. So that's just to explain what that means. PP would be like really soft and FF would be really loud. So I think he's kind of left it open for, I think, Kumi Wadia, who must have been conducting, to take a call on that, whether she wanted to end it on a really big high, so in which case it would be FF, for double forte, or pianissimo, really soft. Quite interesting. I never noticed that before. So we move on now back to, as we're drawing to the end of this talk, we're just, I think, 2 clips away from finishing. We're going to go back to one of his iconic jingles. And this is the Garden Vareli jingle in 1987. And the great Ustad Sultan Khan Saab played Sarangi on this. And I'm told that Vanraj went crazy because Indian musicians usually play very improvised. They don't write stuff down. They prefer to learn it by memory, and they play wonderfully by memory. Western classical musicians, usually most of them want to write everything down and read it and play it. And Vanraj would like to notate and write a lot of his stuff down because he didn't want people to constantly improvise and change his thoughts and ideas. And it seems Khan Saab was playing various melodies in and out and in and out, and Vanraj was going crazy during the recording, trying to tell him, no, that I want this melody, please play just this melody. So some of you may have, of course, heard this and seen this on television many, many years ago.
The finest in saris, garden.
So this wonderful melody, I think it just struck a chord in everyone. And then he decided to really develop this. And he wrote a wonderful piece called Sinfonia Concertante. It was a piece in 5 movements. And he incorporated this theme in movement number 3. And this was performed by the Symphony Orchestra of India in, I think, 2017 at the NCPA. But interestingly, one day he had come over for dinner, and my aunt who lived in Birmingham had also come down, and I had invited her as well. And she met Vanraj, and they got along really well. And Vanraj was telling her about this, that he'd written this piece and he wished it could be played somewhere abroad. And she said, look, give me the music. I'm not a musician, but I know a lot of people in Birmingham. I know the people in the symphony orchestra there. So she took the music of this and she gave it to the conductor there. And the principal cellist of the Birmingham Symphony Orchestra really took a liking to this. And he performed it. What year would that be, Shwetant?
2009.
2009.
Mm-hmm.
So as you know, as you can see, the musicologist has got everything on the archivist has every date on his fingertips. So yeah, 2009, it was performed in Birmingham. And this movement, which sort of reuses the Garden Vareli theme in a form best associated with Mozart and the 17th and 18th century Italian masters of string writing. That's what Vanraj wrote about it in the program notes. And Shwetant says he once played it at a presentation he did on Vanraj. Shwetant, you want to just speak about that, the Berkeley presentation you did?
Well, yeah. Well, I was at Berkeley for 3.5 years. I just returned from there, and I made it a point to be a crusader for Vanraj and his music. I played it to everyone. And in fact, the clip we played earlier from the documentary, that didn't sound like Vanraj at all. I would play music like that to my friends and ask them to guess who did it. And they would throw out all kinds of enlightening but very wrong names. They would say, oh, this is Tangerine Dream or Prince or Kraftwerk or something like that. So I did a presentation on his classical music once. And I played this and the movement you're about to hear. And after it was done, someone said, that is more neoclassical than anything Stravinsky ever wrote. And I think Vanraj would have been very happy to hear that.
with that, we come to the end of today's talk. There's a few people I'd like to thank. First of all, I'd like to thank Shwetant, because all the stuff you see, all the notational stuff is all his work, scanned, neatly put together, following the music. It's a monumental task, very, very time consuming. I'd like to thank Rani and all the people who have organized this talk for inviting us to speak. Thank you to Kunal for the clips, and anybody else I'm forgetting. The idea behind this was to try and show you his music, how diverse he was, what a great performer and composer he was. And he did get his due recognition, I think, in the film industry and in these jingles and everything that he wrote, which was fine. But I honestly feel he never really got the recognition he should have got on a world stage for the kind of music you just heard at the end. And those were the days there was no internet, no WhatsApp, you could not share music the way we can today. I think if this music was played today and if it was got across to composers abroad or film directors abroad, his name would be recognized on a far, far larger platform than it is. And I think it's now up to us to kind of keep that legacy alive. So thank you all. Shwetant, if you'd like to say something.
Well, we are doing our best, a small number of us, most of whom are here right now, or have otherwise helped organize it. We are trying our utmost to get this music out to the public at large. All his work is currently being copyrighted. Most of the archiving is still going on. Now, unfortunately, Vanraj didn't hold much of an opinion of all the work he had done. In fact, he had once very gleefully told me that he threw away 60 tape reels of his music because he didn't think it was any good. Now, we beg to differ. So, hopefully someday in the future, someday very soon, you will be able to access all this music, hear it on your platform of choice. You might, if you are musically inclined, you might be able to buy the scores and study them if you like, because there's an entire treasure trove of music waiting to be discovered here, and we are trying to make that accessible to everyone. So do watch this space, as they say. We'll be back.
We have a few questions from the audience for Zubin and Shwetant. I will read a few of them out. Abhijit Mukul Kishore, hello sir. He says, thanks so much for this lovely and very moving program. Another beautiful work of his for television was for Vijay Mehta's Lifeline or Jeevan Rekha. Can't find it anywhere. I think this is a job for the archivist to answer.
Well, see, I have been looking for that music, in fact, for that serial myself for many, many years. There is no copy of it at Vanraj's place. I have spoken to some musicians who have worked on it, but unfortunately in this country, we do not value our past very much. There is no tradition of documenting things. So our best bet right now is either for the people who made this show to make it available to us so we can clip the music, or for someone who has recorded it on VHS to put it up on YouTube, in which case I can rip the music. It's not the best option, but it's the most we can work with. So if we do get it, we'll get back to you.
Vijay Kumar has a question for Zubin. For such a path-breaking musician who was ahead of his time, how do you think Vanraj got his due from the industry? I think you've partially answered the question, but if you want to...
Yeah, as I just said, I'll just reiterate my point that, film work, he was very widely recognized, not in the commercial films as much as I think he wanted to be recognized. See, he was a guy who he wasn't, I'm only going to do art films. No, that was not his thing. He'd do anything that came that interested him. And I think in the film world, he was definitely very, very well recognized because he was so unique. In the jingle work, he was undoubtedly the king in those years that he reigned. But the other side of him, the other serious writing side of it, opera, classical music, piano writing, that unfortunately, as I said, did not get the kind of exposure it should have. And again, I think it's because of technology. In those days, it was very difficult to get the score to anybody. You had to know someone who knew someone, mailed, etc. People were busy. Today, you can do it by email, send stuff across, WhatsApp, YouTube. So I think that we're going to try and do somehow.
Thank you. Rupam Jyoti Bora, another question for the archivist. Do you have audio for all the 6 choirs from 6 seasons?
Yes, in fact, we do have a recording of one of, I think, from the very first performance, which was done somewhere in the US. Now, again, unfortunately, none of this music is copyrighted yet, and seeing as Vanraj lived his last years in penury, it would do him a disservice to disseminate his music for free right now. So rest assured, it will be released someday and you will be able to hear it legally. This music is there. And since it's a classical work, if there isn't a performance of it already, someone else will perform it. So again, watch this space. We'll be back.
So I've just received a message from Kunal to say that maybe somebody could contact Vijaya Mehta for the recording of Lifeline. Perhaps she might have it.
Will do.
There are several people thanking you for the program, are loving the program this evening. Lakshmi Krishnamurthy, this is the last question for today, says, what a marvelous out-of-the-box man who lived by his own rules. Is there a film being made about him?
Well, I sincerely hope there will be someday, because it will be the most interesting and bizarre and educating and entertaining film ever made, that I can guarantee you. See, there was not a single session where you didn't go home laughing and recounting some anecdote that happened with Vanraj. It was just a given that when you were called on a session, you would have great fun. You would be shouted out if you made a mistake. You would be complimented if you played well. And he was just a fascinating man. So I hope someday somebody can do that. But Shwetant is involved in writing a book about him. So I think that's the first step, get the book published, and hopefully someone can come up with a script and a film idea. That would be wonderful.
There is one small problem, however. I can't think of anyone who could play Vanraj.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Although there are a few other questions coming in, we are unfortunately running out of time. What a lovely evening to be bathed in such music from a man made of music who has made all our lives that much richer. Thank you, Zubin and Shwetant, for taking us on this journey that we will all remember for a long time to come. Thank you, Kunal, for sharing your memories of him. Thank you, Rani De Burra, for making this happen, and for everybody who has shared information, music, clips, and their lives with Vanraj and therefore us this evening. Thank you all thank you for the audience who has joined us this evening. And all I can say now is good night and see you next time.
Good night and thank you. And sorry, I forgot to thank Rani De Burra myself. Thanks, Rani, for everything.